They tell you that your exhaustion is personal, that your fatigue is a failure of character, that if you are worn down, it is because you did not try hard enough. This is the first lie of the system. Your tiredness is not accidental. It is engineered. It is produced with the same cold calculation as profit itself. A society that claims to reward effort has perfected the art of draining it, because a population that is merely tired will obey where a hopeless one might rebel. Capital does not require your despair. Despair can become dangerous. Despair can turn into rage. What the system requires is something far more useful: your quiet exhaustion, your acceptance at the end of a long day, your willingness to postpone justice until tomorrow because today you are too tired to fight. This is how domination is maintained, not through chains alone, but through routine, repetition, and the slow theft of human energy. Look closely at the world that surrounds you. Wealth accumulates in fewer hands than ever before, while the many are instructed to compete with one another for survival. Labor creates everything, yet owns almost nothing. The worker produces abundance, but receives insecurity. This contradiction is not a mistake within capitalism, it is its foundation. Capital lives by extracting surplus from labor, and it survives by disguising exploitation as necessity. The ruling class presents this arrangement as natural, eternal, and unavoidable. They speak of markets as if they were laws of physics, of inequality as if it were a moral outcome, and of poverty as if it were an individual defect. But history tells a different story. Every economic system that claimed permanence was born, maintained, and eventually destroyed by material conditions and class struggle. Capitalism is no exception. To maintain itself, this system must do more than extract labor. It must shape consciousness. It teaches workers to blame themselves rather than the structure that exploits them. It fragments the working class into identities that compete instead of unite. It converts time into wages and life into transactions. And when the contradictions sharpen, when wages stagnate and prices rise, when work expands and security disappears, it offers not liberation but distraction and exhaustion. You are encouraged to work longer, not to live better. You are encouraged to be patient, not to be powerful. You are encouraged to survive individually, never to organize collectively. This is not because collective power is impossible, but because it is dangerous to those who profit from your isolation. Yet the system carries within it the seeds of its own undoing. Capital concentrates workers together, forces cooperation in production, and creates shared conditions of struggle. The very process that exploits labor also produces the possibility of its liberation. When workers recognize themselves not as isolated failures, but as a class with shared interests, the illusion begins to crack. Class consciousness is not an abstract idea. It is the moment when the worker understands that exhaustion is political, that insecurity is structural, and that poverty in a world of abundance is a crime of organization, not fate. It is the realization that nothing fundamental will change through individual escape alone. As long as the system remains intact, any personal victory is temporary and conditional. The ruling class fears this understanding more than any protest. For when workers unite, production itself becomes a site of power. The hands that build society can also halt it. The minds that sustain the system can also redesign it. History advances not through moral appeals to the powerful, but through organized pressure from below. Do not be deceived by reforms that leave ownership untouched and power unchanged. A system built on exploitation cannot be humanized at its core. It can only be transformed. The abolition of exploitation requires the abolition of the conditions that make it possible: private control over social production, the commodification of labor, and the rule of profit over human need. The struggle ahead is not easy, and it is not meant to be. Those who benefit from your exhaustion will resist your awakening. They will call it unrealistic, dangerous, or immoral. But every gain made by the working class was once dismissed in the same way. Rights are never granted willingly. They are taken through organization, solidarity, and struggle. You are not tired because you are weak. You are tired because you carry a system on your back that was never meant to serve you. And when that burden is recognized not as personal failure but as collective oppression, fatigue can turn into force. Workers of the world have nothing to lose but the exhaustion imposed upon them, and a world to win through unity, consciousness, and organized action. Exhaustion under capitalism is not an accidental byproduct of modern life, but a deliberate condition produced by the logic of profit and control. The system depends on the continuous extraction of human energy, not only from the body but from the mind, and it organizes society in such a way that workers are kept perpetually drained yet functional. This exhaustion is not designed to break people completely, because total collapse would disrupt production, but to wear them down just enough that resistance feels impossible and submission feels practical. A tired population is easier to manage than a desperate one, because fatigue dulls anger, blunts imagination, and replaces collective ambition with the immediate need to survive the next day. Capitalism converts time itself into a commodity, measured, sold, and extracted with ruthless efficiency. The worker's day is stretched to its limits, while wages are calibrated to ensure dependence rather than security. Long hours, precarious contracts, and the constant threat of unemployment create a condition where rest becomes a luxury rather than a right. Even outside the workplace, the worker remains bound to labor through anxiety, debt, and the pressure to remain competitive. This extension of work into every corner of life ensures that exhaustion becomes permanent, not episodic, and that recovery is never complete. The ideological function of exhaustion is as important as its economic role. When workers are tired, they are less likely to question the structure that exploits them. Critic: our thought requires time, energy, and mental space, all of which are systematically denied. Political engagement is framed as an additional burden rather than a necessity, something to be postponed until after work, after responsibilities, after survival. In this way, capitalism presents itself as inevitable, not through persuasion alone, but through the physical and psychological depletion of those who might oppose it. Exhaustion also individualizes suffering. Each worker is taught to interpret their fatigue as a personal failure, a lack of discipline, or an inability to manage time effectively. Structural exploitation is hidden behind narratives of self-improvement and resilience. The system celebrates those who endure exhaustion without complaint, turning burnout into a badge of honor and self-sacrifice into a moral virtue. This moralization of fatigue prevents workers from recognizing their shared condition and transforms collective exploitation into private shame. The competitive structure of capitalism intensifies this exhaustion by forcing workers to measure themselves against one another rather than against the system itself. Scarcity is artificially maintained, ensuring that workers remain locked in rivalry for wages, promotions, and basic security. This competition consumes emotional and mental energy, further weakening the capacity for solidarity. When survival depends on outperforming others, unity becomes risky and resistance becomes isolating. Exhaustion thus fragments the working class, preventing the formation of collective power. Technology, often presented as a tool of liberation, is absorbed into this machinery of exhaustion. Rather than reducing technological advances are used to increase productivity, accelerate pace, and blur the boundaries between work and rest. Constant connectivity ensures that workers are always reachable, always accountable, always available. The promise of efficiency becomes a demand for constant output, and the worker's nervous system is pushed to adapt to rhythms that favor capital rather than human well-being. Exhaustion also serves to stabilize inequality. When workers are tired, they lack the energy to challenge the distribution of wealth that leaves them struggling, while a small minority accumulates excess. Fatigue narrows the horizon of possibility, making systemic change appear unrealistic or dangerous. The immediate need to recover from daily labor overshadows the long-term need to transform the conditions that produce that labor. In this way, exhaustion functions as a form of social control, more subtle than repression, but no less effective. The system maintains this exhaustion through cycles of hope and disappointment. Workers are encouraged to believe that relief is just one promotion, one raise, or one opportunity away. This promise keeps them invested in the system even as it drains them. When these hopes inevitably fail, the blame is redirected inward, reinforcing the cycle of overwork and self-doubt. Exhaustion thus becomes self-reinforcing, sustained by both material conditions and ideological reinforcement. By keeping workers perpetually tired, capitalism suppresses not only resistance but imagination. A society that never rests cannot envision alternatives. The energy required to dream of a different world is consumed by the effort to endure the existing one. Exhaustion narrows life to maintenance, reducing human potential to mere functionality and ensuring that the system is reproduced day after day through bodies that are too tired to rebel. Capitalism presents exploitation not as a choice imposed by power, but as an unavoidable condition of life, masking domination behind the language of necessity and survival. It teaches workers that selling their labor is not a social arrangement shaped by history, but a natural requirement of existence, as inevitable as hunger or gravity. By framing exploitation as necessity, the system removes it from moral and political questioning and relocates it into the realm of common sense, where obedience appears rational and resistance appears foolish or dangerous. At the heart of capitalism lies the extraction of surplus value, the appropriation of labor beyond what is returned to the worker in wages. This process is rarely described as exploitation. Instead, it is celebrated as productivity, efficiency, and growth. The worker is told that wages reflect fair exchange, that profit is the reward for risk, and that inequality is the outcome of merit. These narratives obscure the fundamental reality that labor creates value while capital merely claims ownership over it. The necessity of profit is elevated above the necessity of human well-being, and exploitation is reframed as economic responsibility. Capitalism insists that there is no alternative to this arrangement. Work under private ownership is portrayed as the only way society can function, even as it generates poverty alongside abundance. The fear of unemployment becomes a powerful disciplinary tool, compelling workers to accept conditions that would otherwise be intolerable. Long hours, unsafe environments, stagnant wages, and chronic insecurity are justified as unfortunate but necessary sacrifices in the name of competitiveness and economic stability. In this way, exploitation is normalized through fear, and compliance is extracted through the threat of deprivation. The ideological machinery of capitalism reinforces this disguise by individualizing economic outcomes. Success and failure are presented as personal achievements or shortcomings rather than expressions of structural power. When workers struggle, they are encouraged to blame their skills, their effort, or their attitude, never the system that profits from their vulnerability. This personalization of exploitation dissolves collective awareness and replaces it with guilt and self-correction. The system exploits not only labor but also conscience, convincing the exploited to police themselves. Institutions that claim neutrality often serve to reinforce this necessity. Education systems prepare individuals not for critical thought, but for employability, training obedience to schedules, authority, and evaluation. Legal frameworks protect property and profit far more rigorously than human need, while presenting these protections as the foundation of order and fairness. Media narratives celebrate wealth accumulation while portraying poverty as an unfortunate but unavoidable feature of reality. Through these channels, exploitation is woven into everyday life as a background condition rather than a political choice. Even suffering is rationalized through the language of necessity. Workers are told that austerity is required during crises, that sacrifices must be made for recovery, and that patience will eventually be rewarded. These demands are rarely imposed on those who control capital, yet they are framed as collective responsibility. Exploitation deepens during crises, but it is presented as temporary and unavoidable, while the structural causes remain untouched. Necessity becomes a one-directional command issued downward, never upward. Capitalism also disguises exploitation by fragmenting it across global systems. The distance between production and consumption conceals the human cost of commodities. Workers in different regions are pitted against one another through wage competition, while multinational capital moves freely in search of cheaper labor. This global division allows exploitation to be perceived as unfortunate conditions elsewhere, rather than as a unified system of extraction. Necessity becomes geographical, racialized, and externalized, further obscuring responsibility. The promise of upward mobility functions as another layer of disguise. Workers are encouraged to believe that exploitation is temporary, a stage to be endured on the path to security or ownership. This belief sustains compliance even when mobility is statistically rare. The hope of escape individualizes ambition and delays collective action, transforming exploitation into a test of endurance rather than a condition to be abolished. By presenting exploitation as necessity, capitalism transforms domination into routine. It trains workers to accept injustice not because they agree with it, but because they are convinced there is no other way to live. This illusion is maintained not through force alone, but through repetition, GUI, and the constant pressure of material need. When exploitation is naturalized, resistance must first break the spell of necessity before it can challenge power. The ruling class sustains its power not only through ownership of wealth and control of institutions, but by systematically fragmenting and isolating the working class, preventing it from recognizing itself as a unified force. Division is not a secondary effect of capitalism. It is a central strategy. A fragmented class cannot organize effectively, cannot identify its true adversary, and cannot transform shared exploitation into collective resistance. Isolation weakens solidarity, and without solidarity, power remains concentrated in the hands of those who already possess it. Capitalism structures society in ways that encourage competition rather than cooperation among workers. Jobs are scarce by design. Wages are unevenly distributed, and advancement is framed as a zero-sum contest. Workers are compelled to view one another as rivals for survival rather than allies in struggle. This competition consumes energy and attention that might otherwise be directed toward challenging the system itself. When workers are locked in rivalry, the ruling class is freed from scrutiny, able to govern from above while conflict is redirected horizontally. Fragmentation also operates through social and cultural divisions. Differences of nationality, race, religion, gender, and identity are exaggerated and weaponized, not to celebrate diversity, but to prevent unity. These divisions are rooted in material conditions, but are amplified ideologically to obscure class relations. Workers who share the same economic exploitation are encouraged to distrust or resent one another, while the structures that benefit from their division remain invisible. The ruling class profits from these fractures by presenting itself as neutral or even as a mediator, while continuing to extract value from all sides. The organization of labor itself reinforces isolation. Workplaces are structured hierarchically, with authority concentrated at the top and workers segmented into departments, roles, and contracts that limit interaction. Precarious employment, temporary contracts, and gig labor dissolve stable communities and make collective action risky. When workers are uncertain about their future, they are less likely to confront power. Isolation becomes internalized as self-preservation, and silence is mistaken for safety. Geographical separation further weakens collective consciousness. Workers are scattered across cities, regions, and nations, while capital operates globally. This spatial fragmentation allows exploitation to appear local and disconnected rather than systemic. When wages are suppressed in one place, workers elsewhere are told they must accept similar conditions to remain competitive. The ruling class uses this global competition to pit workers against one another, ensuring that grievances are directed outward rather than upward. Ideology plays a crucial role in sustaining this fragmentation. The ruling class promotes narratives that emphasize individual success, personal responsibility, and self-reliance. Collective struggle is portrayed as outdated, inefficient, or dangerous, while individual ambition is celebrated as the highest virtue. This ideology isolates workers psychologically, convincing them that their fate is theirs alone to manage. When hardship is experienced individually, it is endured quietly. When it is recognized collectively, it becomes intolerable. Even forms of resistance are often fragmented and contained. Isolated protests, symbolic gestures, and limited reforms are encouraged over sustained, organized movements that challenge ownership and power. By channeling dissent into safe and disconnected expressions, the system neutralizes its transformative potential. Workers are allowed to speak, but not to organize in ways that threaten the foundations of exploitation. The ruling class also maintains isolation through control of time and exhaustion. Long working hours, unstable schedules, and constant economic pressure leave little space for political engagement or community building. When workers are too tired to gather, to discuss, and to plan, isolation becomes a lived reality rather than an abstract condition. Fragmentation is reproduced daily through routines that keep people apart and focused on immediate survival. This isolation distorts perception. Workers may sense injustice, but without shared analysis and organization, that sense remains vague and unfocused. Anger is redirected towards scapegoats rather than structures, and frustration is internalized as failure. The ruling class benefits from this confusion, as it allows exploitation to continue without coordinated opposition. The power of the ruling class depends on preventing the working class from recognizing itself as a class. Once workers see that their struggles are interconnected, that their isolation is imposed rather than natural, and that unity is a source of strength rather to unrisk, the balance of power begins to shift. Fragmentation is the shield behind which domination hides, and the moment that shield cracks, the authority it protects becomes unstable. Class consciousness transforms fatigue from a private burden into a shared recognition of injustice, converting exhaustion into a force capable of collective resistance. When workers remain isolated, tiredness feels personal and meaningless, an individual struggle to endure rather than a signal of structural violence. Class consciousness changes this perception by revealing that fatigue is not randomly distributed, but systematically imposed, produced by economic relations that extract energy from the many for the benefit of the few. In this realization, exhaustion ceases to be a source of shame and becomes evidence of exploitation. Under capitalism, fatigue is experienced in silence. Each worker carries it alone, believing their weariness to be a failure of discipline or resilience. Class consciousness breaks this silence by naming the cause. When workers understand that their exhaustion is shared, that it arises from long hours, insecure conditions, and constant economic pressure, fatigue is no longer internalized as weakness. It becomes a common language through which workers recognize one another. This recognition is the first step toward resistance, because what is shared can be organized, and what is organized can act. The transformation of fatigue into resistance requires a shift in understanding from individual survival to collective struggle. Class consciousness reframes tiredness as a political condition rather than a biological limit. It reveals how capitalism depends on keeping workers depleted, not only physically but mentally, so that they lack the energy to question, imagine, or resist. Once this mechanism is exposed, exhaustion itself becomes a site of awareness. Workers begin to see that their lack of rest is not a personal mismanagement of time, but the result of a system that values profit over human life. This awareness alters the emotional content of fatigue. Instead of resignation, exhaustion begins to generate anger. Not the scattered anger of isolated individuals, but a focused anger directed at the structures responsible for exploitation. Class consciousness provides a framework that channels this anger away from self-blame and toward collective action. It teaches that the solution to exhaustion is not individual escape or self-optimization, but the transformation of the conditions that produce it. Through class consciousness, fatigue becomes a point of connection rather than separation. Workers recognize that their struggles mirror those of others across workplaces, industries, and borders. This recognition dissolves the illusion that hardship is unique or deserved. It replaces isolation with solidarity, allowing workers to see their exhaustion as part of a larger pattern of exploitation. Solidarity does not eliminate fatigue immediately, but it gives it meaning, and meaning turns endurance into determination. Collective resistance emerges when workers act on this shared understanding. Class consciousness reveals that the same labor that exhausts workers also sustains society. The realization that production depends on their participation transforms fatigue into leverage. Workers begin to understand that their exhaustion is not a sign of powerlessness, but proof of their central role in the economy. If labor can be extracted, it can also be withheld. Fatigue, once recognized collectively, becomes a reason to organize rather than to withdraw. This transformation also reshapes time. Capitalism fragments time into shifts, deadlines, and payments, leaving workers with little space to reflect. Class consciousness reclaims time as a collective resource. Through discussion, education, and organization, workers create moments where exhaustion is analyzed rather than merely endured. These moments are acts of resistance in themselves, because they interrupt the cycle of work and recovery that keeps exploitation intact. Class consciousness does not deny the reality of fatigue, it politicizes it. It understands that tired bodies and minds are the raw material from which resistance must be built. Rather than waiting for ideal conditions, it recognizes that struggle emerges precisely from conditions of strain. Fatigue becomes a reminder of what must change, a daily confirmation that the existing order is unsustainable. As class consciousness deepens, exhaustion loses its power to pacify. Workers begin to see rest not as an individual reward, but as a collective demand, inseparable from dignity and freedom. Fatigue no longer silences them, it speaks through them. In this process, tiredness is transformed from a tool of control into a catalyst for unity, and unity into organized resistance, capable of challenging the system that made exhaustion seem inevitable in the first place. Only organized unity can dismantle a system built on exploitation, because exploitation itself is collective, structured, and sustained through coordinated power. Capitalism does not operate through isolated acts of injustice, but through an interconnected system of ownership, production, and control that spans institutions, nations, and generations. To confront such a system with individual resistance is to misunderstand its nature. Isolated defiance can be absorbed, redirected, or crushed, but collective organization strikes at the foundation of exploitation by confronting power where it actually resides. The system thrives on the illusion that change is a matter of personal effort or moral appeal. Workers are encouraged to believe that working harder, adapting faster, or enduring longer will eventually secure dignity and stability. This belief serves the ruling class by keeping resistance fragmented and harmless. Individual success stories are elevated precisely because they suggest that the system works, while the structural reality of mass exploitation remains untouched. Organized unity dissolves this illusion by shifting focus from personal outcomes to collective conditions. Exploitation persists because power is concentrated, and power is concentrated because ownership and decision-making are removed from those who produce social wealth. Organized unity challenges this concentration by bringing workers together across roles, sectors, and identities, transforming scattered labor into a coordinated force. When workers act together, they cease to be interchangeable units of labor and become a social class aware of its own strength. Unity exposes the dependency of capital on labor, revealing that what appears dominant is in fact fragile. Without organization, unity remains symbolic. Spontaneous and shared frustration can erupt, but without structure it dissipates. Organization gives unity durability, direction, and strategy. It allows workers to move from reaction to action, from protest to sustained pressure. Through organization, demands are clarified, leadership is developed, and collective memory is preserved. The ruling class fears organization more than outrage because organization converts dissatisfaction into power. Exploitation adapts constantly, reshaping itself through laws, technology, and global arrangements. Only organized unity can adapt in response. Individual resistance is predictable and manageable, but collective organization introduces uncertainty into a system that depends on control. When workers coordinate strikes, slowdowns, or collective refusals, they disrupt the smooth functioning of exploitation. These disruptions reveal that the system's stability depends not on natural order but on continued compliance. Organized unity also counters the divisions that exploitation relies upon. Capitalism fragments workers by design, encouraging competition and mistrust. Organization creates spaces where shared interests are identified and differences are contextualized rather than weaponized. It does not erase diversity, but it situates it within a common struggle against exploitation. Through unity, workers learn that their differences are not the cause of their oppression, but tools used to sustain it. The transformation of consciousness is inseparable from organized unity. As workers come together, they exchange experiences, develop analysis, and collectively interpret their conditions. What was once felt as confusion becomes clarity. What was once endured in silence becomes articulated as injustice. Organization educates not through doctrine alone, but through practice, teaching workers their own power by exercising it together. Exploitation cannot be voted away or reformed out of existence through isolated policy changes. As long as the structures of ownership and profit remain intact, exploitation reappears in new forms. Organized unity addresses this reality by targeting the roots rather than the symptoms. It recognizes that lasting change requires altering who controls production and for what purpose. This is not a moral demand, but a material necessity arising from the contradictions of the system itself. History demonstrates that every meaningful advance made by the working class was achieved through organized struggle. Rights were not gifts, they were concessions extracted under pressure. The ruling class concedes nothing without force, and organized unity is the only force capable of compelling such concessions. Without it, exploitation continues uninterrupted, adapting and expanding, while resistance remains scattered and ineffective. Organized unity does not promise ease or immediate victory. It demands discipline, patience, and sacrifice. But it is the only path that matches the scale and coherence of the system it confronts. Exploitation is organized, global, and relentless, and only an equally organized, conscious, and unified working class can dismantle it by asserting collective power over the conditions of life and labor that have long been controlled by a few. The truth that runs through all of this is unavoidable. The system endures not because it is just, but because it is organized, and it will only fall when those it exploits become organized in return. Exhaustion, exploitation, division, and isolation are not separate problems, but interconnected tools of domination, designed to keep power concentrated and resistance scattered. Once these mechanisms are understood, they lose their mystique. Fatigue becomes evidence, not weakness. Exploitation becomes visible, not natural. Division becomes recognized as strategy, not destiny. In that recognition lies the beginning of transformation. History does not move forward through patience or individual escape, but through collective awareness and coordinated action. When the working class understands itself as a class, when it organizes its strength instead of internalizing its suffering, the foundations of exploitation begin to crack. The system does not fear your despair, it fears your unity, and the moment unity replaces isolation, obedience gives way to resistance, and resistance opens the path to a world shaped not by profit, but by human need and collective power.